a WikiVidi Documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Artificial Neural Network. Artificial neural networks or connectionist systems are computing systems vaguely inspired by the biological neural networks that constitute animal brains. The neural network itself isn't an algorithm. But rather a framework for many different machine learning algorithms to work together and process complex data inputs. Such systems learn to perform tasks by considering examples, generally without being programmed with any task-specific rules. For example, in image recognition, they might learn to identify images that contain cats by analyzing example images that have been manually labeled as cat or no cat, and using the results to identify cats in other images. They do this without any prior knowledge about cats, and more, that they have fur, tails, whiskers and cat-like faces. Instead, they automatically generate identifying characteristics from the learning material that they process. An ANN is based on a collection of connected units or nodes called artificial neurons, which loosely model the neurons in a biological brain. Each connection, like the synapses in a biological brain, can transmit a signal from one artificial neuron to another. An artificial neuron that receives the signal can process it and then signal additional artificial neurons connected to it. In common ANN implementations, the signal at a connection between artificial neurons is a real number, and the output of each artificial neuron is computed by some nonlinear function of the sum of its inputs. The connections between artificial neurons are called edges. Artificial neurons and edges typically have a weight that adjusts as learning proceeds. The weight increases or decreases the strength of the signal at a connection. Artificial neurons may have a threshold such that the signal is only sent if the aggregate signal crosses that threshold. Typically, artificial neurons are aggregated into layers. Different layers may perform different kinds of transformations on their inputs. Signals travel from the first layer to the last layer, possibly after traversing the layers multiple times. The original goal of the ANN approach was to solve problems in the same way that a human brain would. However, over time, attention moved to performing specific tasks, leading to deviations from biology. Artificial neural networks have been used on a variety of tasks, including computer vision, speech recognition, machine translation, social network filtering, playing board, and video games and medical diagnosis. History. Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts created a computational model for neural networks based on mathematics and algorithms called threshold logic. This model paved the way for neural network research to split into two approaches. One approach focused on biological processes in the brain while the other focused on the application of neural networks to artificial intelligence. This work led to work on nerve networks and their link to finite automata. Hebbian learning. In the late 1940s, Hebb created a learning hypothesis based on the mechanism of neural plasticity that became known as Hebbian learning. Hebbian learning is unsupervised learning. This evolved into models for long-term potentiation. Researchers started applying these ideas to computational models in 1948 with Turing's B-type machines. Farley and Clark first used computational machines, then called calculators, to simulate a Hebbian network. Other neural network computational machines were created by Rochester, Holland, Abbott, and Duda. Rosenblatt created the perceptron, an algorithm for pattern recognition. With mathematical notation, Rosenblatt described circuitry not in the basic perceptron, such as the exclusive OR circuit that could not be processed by neural networks at the time. In 1959, a biological model proposed by Nobel laureates Hubel and Wiesel was based on their discovery of two types of cells in the primary visual cortex: simple cells and complex cells. The first functional networks with many layers were published by Ivanchenko and Lappa in 1965, becoming the group method of data handling. Neural network research stagnated after machine learning research by Minsky and Papert, who discovered two key issues with the computational machines that processed neural networks. The first was that basic perceptrons were incapable of processing the exclusive OR circuit. The second was that computers didn't have enough processing power to effectively handle the work required by large neural networks. Neural network research slowed until computers achieved far greater processing power. Much of artificial intelligence had focused on high-level models that are processed by using algorithms, characterized for example by expert systems with knowledge embodied in if-then rules. Until in the late 1980s, research expanded to low-level machine learning, characterized by knowledge embodied in the parameters of a cognitive model. Backpropagation. A key trigger for renewed interest in neural networks and learning was Werbaugh's backpropagation algorithm that effectively solved the exclusive OR problem by making the training of multi-layer networks feasible and efficient. Backpropagation distributed the error term back up through the layers by modifying the weights at each node. In the mid-1980s, parallel distributed processing became popular under the name connectionism. Rumelit and McClelland described the use of connectionism to simulate neural processes, support vector machines and other much simpler methods such as linear classifiers gradually overtook neural networks in machine learning popularity. However, using neural networks transformed some domains, such as the prediction of protein structures. In 1992, max pooling was introduced to help with least shift invariance and tolerance to deformation to aid in 3D object recognition. In 2010, backpropagation training through max pooling was accelerated by GPUs and shown to perform better than other pooling variants. The vanishing gradient problem affects many layered feed-forward networks that used backpropagation and also recurrent neural networks. As errors propagate from layer to layer, they shrink exponentially with the number of layers, impeding the tuning of neuron weights that is based on those errors, particularly affecting deep networks. To overcome this problem, Schmidt adopted a multi-level hierarchy of networks pre-trained one level at a time by unsupervised learning and fine-tuned by backpropagation. Behnke relied only on the sign of the gradient on problems such as image reconstruction and face localization. Hinton et al. Proposed learning a high-level representation using successive layers of binary or real-valued latent variables with a restricted Boltzmann machine to model each layer. Once sufficiently many layers have been learned, the deep architecture may be used as a generative model by reproducing the data when sampling down the model from the top-level feature activations. In 2012, Ng and Dean created a network that learned to recognize higher-level concepts, such as cats, only from watching unlabeled images taken from YouTube videos. Earlier challenges in training deep neural networks were successfully addressed with methods such as unsupervised pre-training, while available computing power increased through the use of GPUs and distributed computing. Neural networks were deployed on a large scale, particularly in image and visual recognition problems. This became known as deep learning. Hardware-based designs. Computational devices were created in CMOS for both biophysical simulation and neuromorphic computing. Nano devices for very large-scale principal components analyzers. And convolution may create a new class of neural computing, because they are fundamentally analog rather than digital. Cyrussen and colleagues in Schmidt-Huber's group showed that despite the vanishing gradient problem, GPUs makes backpropagation feasible for many layered feed-forward neural networks. Contests. Between 2009 and 2012, recurrent neural networks and deep feed-forward neural networks developed in Schmidt-Huber's research group won 8 international competitions in pattern recognition and machine learning. For example, The bidirectional and multidimensional long short-term memory of Graves et al. Won 3 competitions in connected handwriting recognition at the 2009 International Conference on Document Analysis and Recognition. Without any prior knowledge about the 3 languages to be learned, Cyrusson and colleagues won pattern recognition contests, including the ICANN 2011 Traffic Sign Recognition Competition, the ISB 2012 Segmentation of Neuronal Structures in Electron Microscopy Stacks Challenge, and others. Their neural networks were the first pattern recognizers to achieve human competitive or even superhuman performance on benchmarks such as traffic sign recognition or the MNIST handwritten digits problem. Researchers demonstrated that deep neural networks interface to a hidden Markov model with context-dependent states that define a neural network output layer can drastically reduce errors in large vocabulary speech recognition tasks such as voice search. GPU-based implementations of this approach won many pattern recognition contests, including the ICANN 2011 Traffic Sign Recognition Competition, the ISB 2012 Segmentation of Neuronal Structures in MStacks Challenge, the ImageNet Competition, and others. Deep, highly nonlinear neural architectures similar to the neocognitron and the standard architecture of vision, inspired by simple and complex cells, were pre-trained by unsupervised methods by Hinton. A team from his lab won a 2012 contest sponsored by Merck to design software to help find molecules that might identify new drugs. Convolutional networks. The state-of-the-art in deep learning feed-forward networks alternated between convolutional layers and max pooling layers, topped by several fully or sparsely connected layers followed by a final classification layer. Learning is usually done without unsupervised pre-training. Such supervised deep learning methods were the first to achieve human competitive performance on certain tasks. Artificial neural networks were able to guarantee shift invariance to deal with small and large natural objects in large cluttered scenes, only when invariance extended beyond shift to all ANN learned concepts, such as location, type, scale, lighting, and others. This was realized in developmental networks whose embodiments are where-what networks, WWN1 through WWN7. Models. An artificial neural network is a network of simple elements called artificial neurons, which receive input, change their internal state according to that input, and produce output depending on the input and activation. An artificial neuron mimics the working of a biophysical neuron with inputs and outputs, but is not a biological neuron model. The network forms by connecting the output of certain neurons to the input of other neurons, forming a directed, weighted graph. The weights as well as the functions that compute the activation can be modified by a process called learning, which is governed by a learning rule. Neurons. A neuron with label J receiving an input P_J from predecessor neurons consists of the following components: A_JF, P_J, \theta_J, O_JF_. Often the output function is simply the identity function. An input neuron has no predecessor, but serves as input interface for the whole network. Similarly, an output neuron has no successor and thus serves as output interface of the whole network. Connections, weights and biases. The network consists of connections, each connection transferring the output of a neuron I to the input of a neuron J. In this sense, I is the predecessor of J and J is the successor of I. Each connection is assigned a weight W_. Sometimes a bias term added to total weighted sum of inputs to serve as threshold to shift the activation function. Propagation function. The propagation function computes the input P_J to the neuron J from the output So_I of predecessor neurons and typically has the form P_J \sum_O_I W_. when a bias value added with the function. The above form changes to following: p underscore j backslash sum underscore o underscore I w underscore w underscore, where w underscore is a bias. Learning rule. The learning rule is a rule or an algorithm which modifies the parameters of the neural network in order for a given input to the network to produce a favored output. This learning process typically amounts to modifying the weights and thresholds of the variables within the network. Neural networks as functions. Neural network models can be viewed as simple mathematical models defining a function backslash text style f, x backslash right arrow y, or a distribution over backslash text style x, or both backslash text style x and backslash text style y. Sometimes models are intimately associated with a particular learning rule. A common use of the phrase ANN model is really the definition of a class of such functions. Mathematically, a neuron's network function backslash text style f is defined as a composition of other functions backslash text style g underscore I that can further be decomposed into other functions. This can be conveniently represented as a network structure, with arrows depicting the dependencies between functions. A widely used type of composition is the nonlinear weighted sum, where backslash text style f k backslash left backslash right, where backslash text style k is some predefined function, such as the hyperbolic tangent or sigmoid function or softmax function or rectifier function. The important characteristic of the activation function is that it provides a smooth transition as input values change, i.e., a small change in input produces a small change in output. The following refers to a collection of functions backslash text style g underscore I as a vector backslash text style g. This figure depicts such a decomposition of backslash text style f, with dependencies between variables indicated by arrows. These can be interpreted in two ways. The first view is the functional view. The input backslash text style x is transformed into a three-dimensional vector backslash text style h, which is then transformed into a two-dimensional vector backslash text style g, which is finally transformed into backslash text style f. This view is most commonly encountered in the context of optimization. The second view is the probabilistic view. The random variable backslash text style ff depends upon the random variable backslash text style gg, which depends upon backslash text style hh, which depends upon the random variable backslash text style x. This view is most commonly encountered in the context of graphical models. The two views are largely equivalent, in either case, for this particular architecture. The components of individual layers are independent of each other. This naturally enables a degree of parallelism in the implementation. Networks such as the previous one are commonly called feed-forward, because their graph is a directed acyclic graph. Networks with cycles are commonly called recurrent. Such networks are commonly depicted in the manner shown at the top of the figure, where backslash text style f is shown as being dependent upon itself. However, an implied temporal dependence is not shown. Learning. The possibility of learning has attracted the most interest in neural networks. Given a specific task to solve, and a class of functions backslash text style f, learning means using a set of observations to find backslash text style f backslash in f which solves the task in some optimal sense. This entails defining a cost function backslash text style c, f backslash right arrow backslash math such that, for the optimal solution backslash text style f caret, backslash text style c backslash leak c backslash text style backslash for f backslash in f, i.e. no solution has a cost less than the cost of the optimal solution. The cost function backslash text style c is an important concept in learning, as it is a measure of how far away a particular solution is from an optimal solution to the problem to be solved. Learning algorithms search through the solution space to find a function that has the smallest possible cost. For applications where the solution is data-dependent, the cost must necessarily be a function of the observations, otherwise the model would not relate to the data. It is frequently defined as a statistic to which only approximations can be made. As a simple example, consider the problem of finding the model \text style f, which minimizes \text style ce \left y²right. For data pairs \text style drawn from some distribution \text style \mathcal. In practical situations we would only have \text style n samples from \text style \mathcal, and thus, for the above example, we would only minimize \text style \hat \frac _sum_caret_ny_i². Thus, the cost is minimized over a sample of the data rather than the entire distribution. When \text style n \right arrow \int some form of online machine learning must be used, where the cost is reduced as each new example is seen. While online machine learning is often used when \text style \mathcal is fixed, it is most useful in the case where the distribution changes slowly over time. In neural network methods, some form of online machine learning is frequently used for finite datasets. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?